Hello everyone. Welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. This is Mike Mansholt, a 17-year-old from Germany who went missing under some seriously bizarre circumstances. At the time, Mike was a healthy teen, weighing somewhere between 145 and 170 pounds. But when his body was found, it weighed a shocking 35 pounds. And that wasn't the only strange thing. Nearly all of Mike's internal organs were missing, including his heart, brain, lungs, liver, pancreas, stomach, bladder, and small intestine. But what truly baffled investigators and horrified his family was that his body showed no signs of being cut open or torn apart, making it nearly impossible to believe that animals had done this. So, the question remains, what really happened to Mike Mansholt? Now, you might wonder, how did such a young boy end up traveling to another country all alone? Well, Mike wasn't new to traveling. He had been to many parts of the world since he was a child. Born on August 20, 1998 in the city of Oldenburg, Germany, a place with over 160,000 residents. Mike was raised by his parents Baron and Susan Mansholt. His parents eventually divorced and both moved on to new partners. Mike stayed with his mother, who later had a daughter named Maria, while his father also had a son named Daniel. Despite the family changes, Mike got along well with both his half-siblings and cherished having them around. He had always longed for brothers and sisters to play with. From a young age, Mike had a heart for adventure. He inherited his love for traveling from his father, who once took him on a journey across the Atlantic Ocean in a sailboat, a trip that lasted over 700 days. They also explored Iceland, Scotland, the Caribbean, and more. Mike's father described him as a kind, polite, and calm boy, even though he was full of curiosity and wonder about the world. In July 2016, 17-year-old Mike decided to travel alone for the very first time. His destination, Malta, a beautiful island country in the Mediterranean Sea, just 58 miles south of Sicily, Italy. With a population of around 500,000 and just over 120 square miles of land, Malta is a popular summer destination known for its beaches, warm climate, and low crime rate. Mike flew there to visit his girlfriend, who was attending a language course, and obviously he was very excited to visit her. Now, the meeting with his girlfriend took place on the 8th of July, 2016, when Mike landed on the island of Malta. Wasting no time, he headed straight to Valletta, the capital city, where she was waiting. The two were overjoyed to be reunited, and the island seemed like the perfect setting for a romantic and adventurous getaway. They spent the next few days living in the moment, laughing, exploring, and soaking in the Mediterranean sun. Together, they wandered through colorful streets, relaxed on golden beaches, tasted new foods, and admired Malta's historical charm. It was the kind of trip that felt almost magical. The kind that lives on in your heart long after it ends. But for Mike, the trip wasn't ready to end just yet. As their final day approached and his girlfriend prepared to fly back to Germany, Mike had a change of heart. He realized he had fallen in love, not just with the experience, but with Malta itself. He wanted more time to explore its hidden corners, meet new people, and continue the journey on his own terms. So, he made a choice. He gave his girlfriend a warm goodbye, promising to stay in touch, and then informed his parents that he wanted to remain on the island for a few more days. Back in Germany, Mike's mother, Suzanne, was at home while his father, Baron, was on vacation in Croatia with other family members. Neither parent hesitated when Mike told them about his change of plans. They trusted him deeply. As mentioned earlier, Mike wasn't just any teenager. He had been traveling since he was very young, visiting almost every corner of the world. His parents often said that he was unusually mature for his age. Calm, independent, and resourceful, Mike had a quiet confidence that set him apart. He knew how to handle situations that would rattle even some adults. So, when he told them he wanted to stay a bit longer, they didn't worry. They believed in him. After his girlfriend flew back to Germany, Mike was ready to experience Malta in his own way, solo, spontaneous, and unfiltered. He checked into a hotel in Slemma, a lively coastal city on the northeastern edge of the island. If you've ever been to Sima, you'll know it's a hot spot, bustling with tourists, lined with stylish cafes, restaurants, and boutiques, and always humming with activity. It's also the most densely populated city in Malta, which means something's always happening, no matter the time of day. Mike booked a room at the Astro Hotel, a well-known place in the area that was popular among solo travelers. It wasn't too fancy, but it had everything he needed: a clean room, decent Wi-Fi, and a view of the Mediterranean. It was the perfect base for a young adventurer wanting to explore the island at his own pace. On the morning of the 18th of July, things started off pretty normal, or at least they seemed normal. Hotel surveillance footage captured Mike leaving room 105 at exactly 8:39 in the morning. He looked calm, casual, just a guy starting his day. Around 9:10, he was seen again at the hotel reception desk. He asked a few questions, nothing unusual, just small talk with the staff, probably about local attractions or bike rentals. He was polite, smiling, the same laid-back vibe he always carried. After a brief chat, he headed back upstairs. He stayed in his room for almost an hour. Then at 95, he left room 105 again, and that's the last confirmed sighting of Mike. In the hotel security footage, he was wearing a blue t-shirt with a black backpack slung over one shoulder and his phone in hand. He looked ready for another adventure under the warm Maltese sun. Inside his backpack, he had packed the essentials: his GoPro camera, a portable charger, his ID, a credit card, and some cash. Just enough for a day trip. It was a bright, cloudless day, the kind that makes you want to explore every hidden corner of the island. From there, Mike walked to a nearby port where he rented a mountain bike. It was a blue and black Lombardo, sturdy, perfect for off-road trails. Just minutes later, at exactly 1 that morning, he sent a voice message to his dad via WhatsApp. His voice sounded upbeat and chill. He talked about the bike rental and how he was planning to cycle around the island. He mentioned the steep hills and how he might need to walk the bike in some parts. Mike even promised to send a photo soon, but that picture never came. And that was the last anyone heard from him. For a couple of days, no one heard from Mike, and at first, no one freaked out. Mike was always the adventurous type. He loved exploring on his own, soaking up new places, and living in the moment. It wasn't unusual for him to go quiet for a while. Fast forward to July 22nd. That was the day Mike was supposed to fly back to Germany. His mom, Suzanne, and his sister, Maria, headed to the airport to pick him up. They stood at the arrival gate, scanning every face that walked through, expecting to see Mike rolling in with his backpack and a big smile. But Mike never showed up. At first, they figured maybe he had a layover in Frankfurt and had landed there instead. But then Suzanne's anxiety kicked in. She tried calling Mike's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She kept calling, hoping for a different outcome, but it was the same every time. Nothing. Her gut was telling her something was off. She called the airline for answers, and that's when she got hit with a bombshell. Mike had never boarded the plane. He had missed the flight completely. Now, panic set in. Susan rushed to the police, filing a missing person report in the early hours of July 23. The authorities immediately took it seriously and put things into high gear, coordinating with the Maltese police. As Susan tried to piece things together, another shocker came her way. A German detective working on the case got word from the Maltese authorities. It turns out they'd already been searching for Mike for days. He had actually gone missing long before Susan realized something was wrong on July 18, the very day he rented that mountain bike. Mike had never returned the bike, which he was supposed to drop off the next day. He also never came back to the Astro Hotel to check out or grab his things. Concerned, the hotel manager reported Mike's disappearance to the Maltese police on July 20. While the search for Mike was in full swing, his family in Germany had no idea what was happening in Malta. No one from the Maltese authorities had contacted them about Mike's disappearance. Some say it was because they didn't have the family's contact info. Others claim it was just negligence. Either way, Mike's dad, Baron, was blindsided when he found out. Without wasting any time, he paused his vacation, grabbed Mike's brother, Daniel, and hopped on the first flight to Malta. Though panic was setting in, Baron tried to stay calm, thinking maybe Mike had missed his flight, lost his phone, or something like that. The family held on to hope, convinced Mike would turn up any minute. But what was really eating at Baron was that Mike's phone was off, and there was no sign of him anywhere. Baron stayed in constant contact with the authorities and even joined the search. The police combed every inch of Malta, checking ferries and small aircrafts, while flyers with Mike's face were plastered everywhere. On the 24th of July 2016, Interpol stepped in and the case went international with Germany and Malta working together. Then on the 26th of July, 8 days after Mike vanished, the Maltese police got an anonymous tip. The caller said Mike was last seen near the Dingley Cliffs, 820 feet high and a hot spot for tourists. The guy who rented Mike the mountain bike had even mentioned that Mike had talked about visiting the robot catacombs nearby, so it was likely Mike had passed through that area. A full team was sent to the cliffs. Sniffer dogs, paramedics, firefighters, and Baron and Daniel rushed there, too. By the time they arrived, reporters were already asking questions, and emergency crews were on site. The search dogs soon picked up a scent, and after hours of searching, the unthinkable happened. Mike was found, but not alive. His body was discovered at the bottom of the cliffs, hidden under some bushes in a rocky outcrop. The bike he rented was found 98 feet above him, totally wrecked. Mike's body was sent in for an autopsy, and investigators found his sneakers and sunglasses nearby, but Mike was barefoot. His backpack, containing his phone, laptop, GoPro, money, and credit cards was nowhere to be found. And the strangest part, fresh hay was found near his body, as if someone had stepped on it and left a piece behind. But it couldn't have been Mike. He was barefoot and his sneakers were found several feet away. When they asked the local farmer if he knew anything about the hay, he simply said he didn't. Baron Mike's father wasn't about to let anything slide. After speaking with the farmer near the cliffs, he could tell something was off. The farmer seemed overly nervous, almost like he was avoiding the questions. When Baron asked if he had seen anything unusual or if he knew where Mike's backpack might be, the farmer kept insisting he didn't know anything. But Baron wasn't buying it. His heart was shattered over the loss of his son, but he refused to break down completely. He needed to get to the bottom of what had really happened. Mike's brother, Daniel, was hit the hardest. Unlike some half-siblings who struggled to get along, Daniel and Mike were inseparable. They had been thick as thieves, always dreaming about traveling the world together when they grew older. But now those dreams were ripped away, leaving Daniel with a pain that was impossible to ignore. My brother is a young, tough, athletic guy. He's always looking for a new challenge and a new target he can go on. And he came here for holidays and to explore the beautiful island. And he had a plan to come back. And we have to make it sure that he comes back. When Suzanne, Mike's mother, heard the devastating news, it felt like she was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The idea that her son was gone was simply unimaginable. Mike's sister, Maria, was crushed, too. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and now she would never see her brother again. And then there was Mike's girlfriend, who had already arrived in Germany, waiting eagerly for his return. She had been counting down the days, dreaming of finally being reunited with him. But in the blink of an eye, those plans were shattered, and the future they had imagined together was lost forever. Back then, this case didn't just shake Malta, it rocked the entire world. With Malta having a relatively low crime rate, something as tragic as this was completely unheard of. The news spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of media outlets in both Malta and Germany. But as the investigation dug deeper, even more strange and bizarre things started to unfold. Mike had always been obsessed with documenting his travels, filming every moment, which is why his GoPro was so important. If he'd captured anything on that last day, it could have been the missing piece to crack the case. But when Mike's body was found, only 3 items were recovered: his sneakers, his sunglasses, and the GoPro case. The case was attached to his belt, but no one knew whether it was empty or if the camera was inside. The GoPro itself nowhere to be found. The moment Bernd, Mike's dad, arrived in Malta, he immediately asked about the GoPro. The lead investigator told him she had seen the GoPro case on Mike's belt and that it had been catalogued. But when Bernd went to check at the Astro Hotel where Mike stayed, all of Mike's belongings were handed over except for the GoPro case. It didn't add up. Bernd couldn't shake the feeling that Mike had taken the case with him, and the camera, possibly holding crucial footage, could be the key to unraveling everything. But the next day, things got even stranger. All the police officers involved in the investigation suddenly denied ever seeing the camera case. They claimed nothing of the sort had been collected. Bernd was stunned. How could they deny it when the lead investigator herself had confirmed it? When he confronted her, she stuck to the same story. There was no case. Something was definitely fishy. Just when it seemed like the case couldn't get any weirder, the police made a statement declaring that Mike's death was an accident. According to them, he had simply fallen from the cliff while riding his bike. But the way Mike's body was found didn't add up to that explanation at all. If he had fallen while riding, he would have dropped straight down, right? But Mike's body was found in a position that suggested he had fallen backward, which was nearly impossible if it was a natural fall. Despite all the inconsistencies, the police quickly closed the case, claiming Mike had fallen from a height of more than 30 meters and had somehow rolled to the spot where his body was discovered. But there was more. The coroner who examined Mike's body told Bernd that Mike hadn't suffered because he had broken his neck in 2 places, which caused almost instant death. But here's the catch. No X-rays had been done on Mike's body at that point. So, how could the coroner make that call? Was he just guessing? A month later, the autopsy report was finally released. It confirmed through DNA testing that the body was Mike's. It also revealed that Mike had been dead for about 8 days by the time he was found, which meant he likely died the very same day he left the hotel to explore the island. But here's the most bizarre part. The autopsy showed that Mike had no broken bones. None. This was highly suspicious, especially considering he supposedly fell from more than 98 feet. If that were true, he should have at least broken an arm or something. So, why weren't there any fractures? This revelation cast doubt on the coroner's statement and made Bernd's suspicions grow. A forensic examination of Mike's rented bike only deepened the mystery. The bike's condition didn't match what would be expected from a fall of over 98 feet from a cliff. Everything was starting to feel wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that just didn't fit. Then just days before the official autopsy report was finalized, an employee from the morgue who had been responsible for Mike's body approached Bernd with a hushed warning. She told him that everything about Mike's death seemed suspicious. No broken bones completely contradicted the police's story, that Mike had simply fallen from the cliff while riding his bike. She urged Bernd to think carefully about his next steps, suggesting that the police seemed to have no interest in pursuing the case any further. This only added to Bernd's growing distrust of the investigation. Desperate for answers, Bernd went to Speak with the head of the investigation, the same officer who had first claimed to have seen the GoPro case attached to Mike's belt, only to later deny it. But this time, she refused to speak with him. She dodged his questions and acted as though the entire matter wasn't worth her attention. This only fueled Byrne's suspicions. Why was the investigation being handled so poorly? Why were they denying even the simplest facts? He kept pressing the authorities about Mike's GoPro, believing it held the key to understanding what really happened. Just days later, the forensic department in Malta handed Byrne a camera, claiming it belonged to Mike. But what they handed him was an old Canon model from the early days of digital photography, not the GoPro Hero 2 that Mike had been using to document his travels. Along with the camera came a memory card, completely destroyed. The authorities claimed it had been found inside the camera when it was recovered next to Mike's body. Byrne immediately knew this was not his son's camera. The authorities were trying to pass off an old outdated camera as Mike's, likely hoping he would stop asking questions about the real GoPro. By now, Mike's family had grown deeply suspicious of the Maltese police. The lack of interest in the case, the inconsistencies, and the strange actions of the authorities were all too much to ignore. Byrne confronted some officers about who might have stolen his son's belongings. The officers almost dismissively claimed that no one from Malta would steal items from a body, suggesting it might have been a tourist. But then there were the phone records. The police claimed they had pulled location data from Mike's phone carrier, only to report that they found absolutely nothing. No records, no trace. Everything seemed to be going in circles. Frustrated with the inconsistencies, the lack of progress, and the growing feeling that something was being hidden, Byrne was ready to make serious accusations against the authorities. But before he could take any action, he had to return to Germany to arrange his son's funeral and deal with the heartbreaking aftermath of the tragedy. Mike's body landed in Germany on August 17, 2016, and what was supposed to be a moment of mourning quickly spiraled into something out of a true crime documentary. The funeral home staff, tasked with preparing his body for burial, were immediately disturbed. Mike's body looked eerily deflated, like someone had let all the air out of him. It was obvious something was wrong. Even worse, he hadn't been embalmed at all. Which was bizarre considering his case was still under investigation. The smell was unmistakably that of raw decomposition, not the usual chemical scent you'd expect from a preserved body. The moment they realized this, the funeral home workers called the police. One officer casually mentioned that airport staff had already thought the coffin felt way too light when it arrived. That was enough to raise every red flag imaginable. Mike's body was quickly sent to the Medical University of Hanover, and what they uncovered was horrifying. His body weighed only 16 kilograms. That's about 35 pounds. When they opened him up, almost all of his internal organs were missing. His brain, heart, lungs, liver, pancreas, adrenal glands, right kidney, bladder, stomach, intestines. Every vital organ was stripped from his body. Only tiny scraps of his left kidney, diaphragm, spleen, and colon remained. No wonder he looked so deflated. He was practically empty. Now, yes, it's normal to remove organs during an autopsy. But here's the catch. They're supposed to be either returned to the body or replaced with something like cotton or sawdust. And if they're not returned, there should be a full report explaining why none of that was done. Mike's body was just left as an empty shell with no explanation, no documentation, and no dignity. His family was devastated. His father, Bern, wrote a heartfelt letter to the Maltese authorities, begging them to send back his son's organs so he could lay him to rest properly. However, what he got back was shocking. The coroner claimed that animals had eaten the organs before Mike's body was found. Seriously? That didn't make any sense. The original Maltese autopsy made zero mention of animal bites or injuries. No claw marks. No chewed up skin, nothing to back up that wild claim. And so the German authorities stepped in. What once looked like a tragic accident was starting to look more and more like a crime. They opened a full investigation. The forensic team in handover asked for a copy of the original autopsy report from Malta, but surprise, it never came. And without Mike's organs, their second autopsy was already limited. But that didn't stop Baron and Suzanne from fighting. They filed a formal complaint and demanded answers. Through their lawyer, they revealed an email from the Maltese coroner where he now claimed rodents had eaten the organs and that Mike's brain had liquefied. The parents were done with the excuses. They took the fight to court and the German prosecutors began leaning into a more sinister theory. What if Mike was murdered? They also called out the Maltese coroners for doing an incredibly sloppy job. A new autopsy was ordered even though the body had already deteriorated. This time Maltese officials had to be present so no one could twist the facts. And once again, the findings were disturbing. There were no bite marks, no signs of rodents, just a small nibble on the neck and a faint abrasion on the forearm. Definitely not enough to explain the missing organs. Plus, it was reconfirmed that Mike's body had been fully intact when it was recovered from under the cliffs and transported to the Maltese morgue. Most importantly, the new autopsy revealed what might be the biggest failure of all. Mike had never been embalmed. Because of that, his body had decomposed too much, destroying any remaining evidence that could have pointed to what really happened. To top it all off, there was absolutely no proof that Mike had died from falling off the cliffs. Nothing matched the story Malta had been pushing. And just like that, a simple case of a missing person found dead had transformed into a full-blown mystery. Despite all of this, the Maltese authorities stood by their version of events, insisting that Mike had tragically fallen off a cliff. The first autopsy done by Malta's own forensic team included 3 people, including Dr. Mario, the country's chief forensic doctor. Dr. Mario, who had an impressive reputation, was there when the body was found and performed the autopsy himself. However, when Mike's parents and journalists asked for more details, Dr. Mario was strangely tight-lipped. He only responded to one email from Mike's father, Baron, saying the organs were already missing before the autopsy, suggesting that rodents had eaten them. He also mentioned that Mike's brain had dissolved due to the sun's heat. Dr. Mario stated that he had shared this information with the head of the investigation, but the German forensic team didn't buy it. They quickly debunked the idea of rodents having eaten Mike's organs, as there were no bite marks found on his body. As for the brain liquefying in the sun, that was just plain absurd, according to the Germans. They pointed out that many countries have summer temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, and no one had ever seen anything like this happen. Furthermore, Dr. Mario had documented that Mike's body was found lying on his back, but the German team didn't believe he died where he was found. They theorized that Mike could have been alive when he hit the beach and crawled to a shaded area under the cliff. They even considered asphyxiation as a possible cause of death, especially because Mike's hyoid bone was missing, an indication of strangulation. By November of 2017, Baron had had enough. He returned to Malta and tried to speak with the police and detectives involved in his son's case, but they wouldn't cooperate. He then filed a legal request to access all the case files, only to be told the judge was sick and known for being slow in approving judicial decisions. Eventually, Baron was able to gain access to the documents through a German diplomat in Malta. But when he reviewed the files, several key pieces were missing. The autopsy results and photos from the crime scene had mysteriously disappeared. In January of 2018, the Maltese government finally caved under pressure from the German authorities and reopened Mike's case. The first documents related to the case were sent to Germany and the German media began covering the story once again. The German parliament even started debating it. However, the new judge assigned to the case also concluded that Mike's death was due to a fall from the cliff and nothing really changed. The German authorities, despite finding numerous inconsistencies in the case, found themselves at a dead end with the limited evidence they had. Most people who analyze the case, full of holes and carelessness from the diplomats, investigators, and journalists, have serious doubts about the Maltese authorities' official verdict. Baron became exhausted and disheartened by all the negligence and decided to stop pushing for more answers. He shifted his focus to his family, feeling that they would never truly know what happened to Mike. A German newspaper that had been following the case from the beginning even tried to revisit the story. But when they reached out to the Maltese authorities, they were met with silence. No one involved in Mike's case seemed willing to talk, almost as if they were trying to cover it up. Theories surrounding Mike's case are still floating around, with one of the most popular being that Mike could have been a victim of organ trafficking. Mike was a healthy young man, and the absence of his organs has made many wonder if he was targeted by traffickers. According to this theory, Mike could have been approached while cycling through a remote area of Malta. The traffickers would have taken him to a location, removed his organs, stitched him back up, and then dumped him off the cliff to make it look like an accident. Some believe the Maltese authorities discovered everything, but chose to cover it up because of the potential damage to tourism. Another theory suggests that Mike was robbed by thieves who took his belongings and then threw him off the cliff. According to this idea, Mike may have been strangled and his body was placed where it was found to prevent further damage to the island's tourism industry. If Mike had been strangled, authorities might have decided to remove his hyoid bone, brain, and other organs to avoid revealing the truth. There's also the possibility that Mike simply fell off the cliff on his own and people who passed by took the opportunity to steal his belongings. The least accepted theory is that Mike might have taken his own life, but that was quickly dismissed early in the investigation. Everything about Mike's life pointed to him being happy, full of plans, in love, and showing no signs of mental illness or depression. Mike. Schultz case remains one of the most mysterious and incomplete cases ever documented. The Maltese authorities still maintain their version of events that Mike fell off the cliff, and anything beyond that is merely a conspiracy theory. Story 2. I know I look crazy, but I'm not crazy. I love my children. I love my boys so much. I wouldn't hurt them. This is the same mom who would later contradict herself in that interview. While most mothers would move mountains and part oceans for their kids, Tiffany Lucas did the exact opposite. However, it wasn't always this way. Back in her hometown, almost everyone believed she was a loving, devoted mother. That was her image, the mom who'd do anything for her boys. But as we've seen time and time again, appearances can lie. Because if she truly were that devoted, we wouldn't be talking about her right now on Into the Deep, the channel where we dive into the darkest and most disturbing crimes on Earth. And no, understanding what led up to this horror doesn't make it okay. But knowing what pushed her over the edge might help us spot red flags in others before it's too late. Because sometimes the signs are there, we just don't notice until tragedy strikes. To possibly understand what pushed Tiffany Lucas to such a horrifying act, we need to look beyond the headlines and into her past. A life that on the surface seemed complicated but not deadly. At 32 years old, Tiffany Ann Lucas, originally from Chicago, Illinois, had two young sons, Jaden and Maurice. Both boys were under 10, each with a different father, and they attended Freedom Elementary School in Bullitt County. The small family lived together in a rented 3-bedroom, 2B home, a modest 1,400 feet space that looked like any other suburban setup from the outside. Additionally, Tiffany had a very tight-knit bond with her father, John Lucas, and was raised alongside her brother. By all accounts, she was her dad's pride and joy, the classic daddy's girl. John saw her as someone special, and Tiffany clearly cherished that relationship. Her presence on social media painted a picture of someone juggling single motherhood with style. She posted tons of selfies, often dressed to impress, showing off her fashion sense, and confidently flaunting her appearance. But beneath the curated photos and glam shots, there was one recurring theme that stood out: her love for her children. Time and time again, her posts showed joyful snapshots of her with Jaden and Maurice laughing, smiling, hugging. From the outside, it looked like she was doing her best to give her boys a happy life. But behind the filtered photos and heart emojis was a woman quietly struggling. Tiffany's early adult life was filled with big dreams and bigger obstacles. She first pursued modeling, which eventually gave way to a leap into entrepreneurship. In 2016, she launched Miss Tiff's One-Stop Shop, a convenience store offering food, tobacco, and odds and ends. It was a bold move, but sadly, the business didn't last. By 2017, the shop had shuttered its doors. In a resurfaced interview, Tiffany explained that she believed part of the failure was due to a Walmart location that was supposed to open nearby, but never did. A lot of people don't make their way down here. But if there's a Walmart, you come out of the woodworks for Walmart, so it probably would have brought a lot of people to, stop and check us out. After her business failed, things seemed to take a darker turn for Tiffany. At 2018, she found herself in trouble with the law. Arrested on drug possession charges, she later pleaded guilty and served a 30-day jail sentence. The court records didn't indicate any signs of violence or erratic behavior, just one misstep in what had otherwise been a quiet legal history. And after that, there was silence. No more run-ins with the law, no major red flags. It seemed like Tiffany was turning a corner, keeping to herself and trying to move forward. She reportedly took up a job that required overnight shifts, though the specifics of her employment remained unclear. For a while, it seemed like life was just rolling along uneventfully. But as we know, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. Because on January 1, 2019, came the devastating event that may have marked the true breaking point for her. Her father, 47-year-old John Lucas, passed away suddenly. For Tiffany, it was as if the very ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Her father had been her rock, the person who gave her strength when she needed it, the one who offered advice, guidance, and unwavering support. His unexpected death left a gaping hole in her world, one that she couldn't fill with anything. In fact, Tiffany opened up about her loss in a deeply emotional Facebook video where her raw grief was on full display. For her, the world had just become a much darker place, and no amount of smiling or posting photos could change that. Even though she tried to hold it together for the sake of her sons, something inside her had undeniably shifted. The grief was suffocating and no amount of time could heal it the way she needed it to. Now, if you think the loss of her father was the main reason behind Tiffany's tragic actions, well, it's both true and not true. Her life continued down a dark and difficult path filled with personal tragedies and heartbreaking struggles that just didn't seem to stop. The death of her father was a profound loss, but it wasn't the last in a series of devastating blows. Just 7 months after she buried her father, Tiffany was dealt another crushing blow. Durrell Howard, the father of one of her sons, was tragically murdered. At the time, she was still reeling from the loss of her dad, trying to figure out how to keep going, how to heal, and then this. Durrell's death added yet another layer of grief that she wasn't prepared for. The case is still an open homicide investigation by the Louisville Metro Police Department. And while the authorities keep searching for answers, Tiffany was left with more pain to bear. But that wasn't the end of it. Within a year, just when Tiffany could barely begin to process all the grief from these losses, she received yet another heartbreaking blow. Her mother, who had always been a part of her life, suffered a stroke and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Imagine the weight of these events, one after the other. Father, then the father of her child, and then her own mother's health, spiraling downward. It was as if everything she held close was slipping away piece by piece. Amidst all these emotional and personal crises, Tiffany also found herself struggling financially. By the time of the tragic events of November 8, things had become absolutely dire for her. The utilities in her home had been shut off, no electricity, no water, and on her kitchen counter, there was an eviction notice, a stark reminder of how precarious her situation had become. For someone like Tiffany, a young mother already bearing the weight of immense grief and stress, this notice wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a looming threat to her and her children's safety and stability. The possibility of losing her home likely triggered an avalanche of emotions. Fear about where she and her children would go. Anxiety about how she would make ends meet and provide for them. And probably a deep sense of shame or guilt. The kind that comes when you're trying so hard to keep it all together only to feel like you're falling short of the expectation society places on you as a mother. That constant pressure to create a secure environment to make it all work while everything around you crumbles is unimaginable. And all of those struggles, those unbearable losses, relentless hardships, and crushing fears would tragically come to a head on November 8 of 2023. What unfolded that day was an unimaginable crime, one that shattered the peaceful facade of a quiet neighborhood and forever altered the lives of those involved. The crime took place in what seemed like an idyllic home nestled on Bentwood Drive in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. A place that on any other day could easily be mistaken for a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with its well-kept yard and the kind of serenity you'd expect from suburban life. But this was no peaceful scene. The horror that occurred in that home was so grotesque, so beyond comprehension, that a local deputy who arrived on the scene remarked that there was no way anyone could have survived what had happened, let alone two young boys, ages 9 and 6. I can tell you this, the boys were shot in an area that would not be survivable for anybody. However, they were alive to the best of our knowledge when they were transported by EMS to the hospital and passed away while at the hospital. Before that day, it all started the evening of Tuesday, November 7th. A neighbor just going about their evening noticed Tiffany Lucas acting unusually agitated outside her home. She was scrubbing the carpets vigorously, her face drawn in a way that suggested something was terribly wrong. Concerned, the neighbor asked if she was okay, and Tiffany gave a vague response, saying only there's a lot going on. The unease in her words, though brief, didn't seem to match the image of a mother caring for her children in a safe home. Little did anyone know that was just the calm before the storm. The next day, the tranquility of a new morning was shattered. At approximately 11 in the morning, a horrifying cry for help shattered the peace of Bentwood Drive. Tiffany, visibly distressed and in utter despair, ran to a neighboring couple's house, shouting, "Help! My kids are dying." The panic in her voice could not be ignored. She collapsed on their driveway, overcome with emotion and fear. The couple's husband rushed into her home, hoping to find some clue, some explanation to what was happening. But what he discovered was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. In the living room, he found Tiffany's two young sons, both gravely injured and bleeding, yet somehow still alive. Their injuries were so severe, so clearly inflicted with brutal intent, that it seemed impossible for them to survive. Nearby, a gun lay on the floor, presumed to be the weapon used to carry out the unthinkable act. Time was running out, and the husband immediately called for help, urging emergency services to rush to the scene. The officers who arrived couldn't believe their eyes. The injuries inflicted on these two innocent children were so devastating, they were considered unsurvivable. The boys were rushed to Norton Children's Medical Center in Louisville, where emergency surgery was performed in a desperate bid to save their lives. But despite the best efforts of the medical staff, the boys succumbed to their injuries. In a matter of hours, two young lives had been taken in a way that no one could have ever anticipated. As the news began to spread, the shock of the tragedy left the citizens of Bullitt County stunned and in disbelief. How could this happen? How could a mother, someone who was supposed to protect and nurture her children, be responsible for such a horrific crime? Less than an hour after the boys were pronounced dead, Tiffany was arrested at the Bullitt County Emergency Medical Services Facility. She was taken into custody, charged with the unthinkable, and held on a bond of $2 million. In a chilling body cam video captured on the day of the murders, Tiffany appeared deeply distressed, far removed from the cheerful, put-together image she often shared on Facebook. Gone was the smiling mother posting filtered snapshots of family moments and hopeful captions. In her place stood a woman consumed by panic, grief, and something far darker. The footage was raw and haunting, a stark contrast to the carefully curated life she portrayed online. "All right, EMS is going to check you out. All right, take this off of you. I'm going to step out for a minute so they can check you out. You want to sit on the bed or what? Yeah. Which way do you want to head? That way. Sit right there. There you go. Sit down right there. Turn your feet that way. Are you hurt anywhere? Where are you hurt? I need to get hurt. Yeah. All she told me was she didn't feel right. I got her up off the ground. Now, let's dive into the most asked and most haunting question of all. What really drove Tiffany to do it? Was it financial hardship? Could money or the lack of it truly push someone to commit something so unthinkable? On the surface, it might seem like a motive. Tiffany had been under tremendous pressure, juggling life as a single mom, dealing with custody battles, navigating failed relationships, and facing the day-to-day grind of simply trying to survive. But is that enough? Many mothers face similar or even greater hardships. Yet, they don't turn to violence. They find a way to fight, to protect, to endure. So, for many following the case, the financial angle felt too shallow, too small a reason to explain such a monstrous act. And then came the chilling twist. In one of her interrogations, Tiffany claimed she was manipulated through Facebook into committing the horrific crime. This bizarre and unsettling statement emerged during a tense 3-hour interview with Detective Beale, who later testified in court. According to him, Tiffany offered no clear reasoning, only scattered thoughts. She reportedly called the shooting an accident and was full of remorse, muttering things like, "I'm so stupid and I'm in such a bad spot. Well, I'm going to talk to you today about," but what really stood out were her attempts to distance herself from responsibility by claiming she was manipulated. According to reports from WDRB, Beale testified in court that Tiffany told him, "I would never do anything like this unless someone manipulated me." Specifically, she suggested that she had been manipulated through Facebook, Wi-Fi, and the Internet. An eerie statement that raised even more questions about her mental state and the factors influencing her behavior. Tiffany's claim that she was manipulated through social media and technology left everyone confused. She didn't explain exactly what kind of manipulation she meant. Was it some kind of online conspiracy? Had she fallen down a dangerous rabbit hole, maybe influenced by groups like QAnon, which have pulled others into dark and destructive thinking? Or was it a sign of a deeper mental breakdown? Sadly, we've seen other cases where people influenced by toxic online communities have committed horrifying acts. So, while it might sound far-fetched at first, the theory doesn't feel completely out of the question, especially when you consider what happened the day before everything fell apart. On November 7 of 2023, Ring doorbell footage from a neighbor's house showed Tiffany standing on their porch with her dog, Blue. What happened next was downright unsettling. She started going off on a strange emotional rant, saying things like she needed this neighbor to be an anchor in her life and that she'd been talking to God. She repeatedly told her dog not to bark, insisting that this was her friend's house and this is her house, as if she truly believed she belonged there. It was bizarre, rambling, and left the neighbor understandably shaken. Later that same day, Tiffany was seen at a Waffle House with her 2 sons. The kids seemed happy, laughing and cracking jokes like any normal day. But Tiffany was completely disconnected. One server said she kept staring off into space, constantly looking over her shoulder like she thought someone was following her. Another said she didn't speak a word to them and that when she went to pay, her hands were shaking and she suddenly burst into tears. Looking back, some of the staff feel like she was silently reaching out for help, but they just didn't realize it at the time. Then came the next day, November 8th. That's when everything bubbling under the surface finally exploded. Neighbors called 911 after hearing gunshots coming from Tiffany's house. More Ring footage captured her at another neighbor's home, crying and pleading for help. When officers arrived, they found her lying face down in the driveway, sobbing and saying, "My sons are dying." Body cam footage shows an officer trying to help her sit up. She looked disoriented and kept saying, "I don't feel right," but didn't seem physically injured. After the tragedy, Tiffany was officially charged with 2 counts of capital murder. At first, she pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that she had experienced a full-blown psychotic episode and genuinely believed she was protecting her sons from some kind of other being. According to her lawyer, Tiffany never imagined a life without her boys. In fact, he said she even tried to turn the weapon on herself after what she had done, but it jammed. He also argued that she had been detoxing from drugs and this breakdown was a symptom of withdrawal. Now, here's something that's both frustrating and mind-boggling. They didn't drug test her when she was booked into jail. How is that not standard procedure? You'd think it would be essential, especially for documentation purposes, but nope. Nothing. Tiffany's trial was originally set for December of 2024, but she ended up changing her plea to guilty. And from what we can tell, there was no deal on the table. It looks like she just threw herself at the mercy of the court. It's possible she knew there was no way around a guilty verdict and decided to let the judge, not a jury, determine her fate, which could have helped avoid an even harsher outcome. During sentencing, both the prosecution and Tiffany's defense made their cases. Her lawyer continued to push the narrative that she was suffering from a psychotic disorder and they played those disturbing clips again, the ones from the day before the tragedy where she told a neighbor she needed help and the footage from the Waffle House with her sons. It was meant to show her deteriorating mental state. 6 family members took the stand that day, delivering heart-wrenching victim impact statements. One of the most emotional came from Morris's father. He broke down in tears, talking about how Jaden was all he had left after losing one son already. And then Tiffany took Jaden, too. He said he had begged Tiffany for custody of his son over and over again, especially due to her drug use, her lifestyle, and the unsafe environment she was raising the boys in. He said he didn't just lose his child on November 8th. He felt like he'd lost him the day he was born, because from that moment on, he was constantly fighting for him. He'd called everyone from his own family to hers, pleading for help, trying to get his son into a safer home. Despite the emotional testimonies, the judge handed down the sentence, 2 life sentences. The judge stated clearly that motherhood isn't just about giving life. It's about providing safety, love, and security. He said he couldn't even begin to imagine the terror those boys felt seeing their own mother holding a gun. Just the thought of the second child hearing the shot that killed the first. It's unbearable. So, she was sentenced to life in prison for both counts of murder. However, under Kentucky law, she'll technically be eligible for parole after serving 20 years. The family is understandably furious about that. The prosecution doesn't believe she'll ever be granted parole, but still, it's a possibility. One of the boys' aunts stood outside the courthouse and promised everyone that she'd be at every parole hearing forever, making sure Tiffany never walks free before you ultimately took their life. Part of the statement I was going to write, I hope every day you close your eyes that they haunt you. But I don't. You don't deserve to see them, and they shouldn't see you. If he decides to give you any kind of leniency today and grant you parole at some point, I'll be there at every parole hearing. Do you hear me? I'll be there at every parole hearing. That same aunt pointed out how much support Tiffany actually had from the family, from her brother's girlfriend, from everyone. She was blunt, saying, "You had a psychotic break because you did." She called out how people try to paint these stories with sympathy because of rough childhoods. But at the end of the day, Tiffany made the choice to take her sons' lives. The aunt believes the only reason Tiffany chose to let the judge sentence her instead of a jury was to avoid even more time. She said she didn't deserve them, and now at least she can't hurt them anymore. Tiffany's defense team stuck to their narrative, insisting this all happened because she was trying to get clean from fentanyl and went psychotic. However, some observers questioned whether she was truly attempting to get clean, as she continued to post curated images of her children on social media just days before the incident. Photos that painted a picture of a happy and stable home life. Given the nature of the crime and the circumstances surrounding the case, it is believed that Tiffany may face challenges during her time in prison. Factors such as the severity of her offense, the public attention surrounding the case, and how she presents herself may impact how she is treated by other inmates. This case has left a family shattered and a community grieving. Many are left reflecting on the signs that were missed, and the efforts made by loved ones to intervene before it was too late. It serves as a stark reminder of how quickly situations can spiral when intervention fails, and of the deep, long-lasting pain left behind when children are lost in such a tragic way. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Story 3. This family seemed like a real-life version of the American dream. But just like many stories we've shared before, looks can be deceiving. It all began like a normal night, a quiet home. A mother tucking her daughter into bed, and nothing out of the ordinary, at least on the surface. But by morning, that same home would become a crime scene. The woman and her 7-year-old daughter both found brutally murdered. And by brutally, we mean this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was rage, evil intent. There were no signs of forced entry, no screams heard in the night, just silence and blood. The city of Palmerston North, small, safe, the kind of place where doors are left unlocked, was shaken to its core. Who could have done this? And why target an innocent family? Pretty soon, suspicions started to swirl. A late-night trip, a shirt with a strange stain, a computer turned off at a very specific time, and suddenly the story everyone thought they knew started to twist. Because in this case, the monster might have been closer than anyone imagined. This is the story of the Lundy murders, and it's going to stay with you. Before everything fell apart, they were just your average family. Mark, Christine, and their daughter, Amber, a tight-knit trio living in Palmerston North. Mark and Christine had been married for 17 years. And Amber, while she was their whole world, their only child, bright, bubbly, and loved by mom and dad, they ran a business together, selling kitchen sinks. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills most of the time. Behind the scenes though, things weren't quite as stable as they seemed. The company was constantly in debt, often owing their supplier close to $100,000. And instead of pulling back, Mark went overboard. In 1999, he made a bold move. He bought 2 plots of land in Hawke's Bay to grow grapes. Dreaming of a vineyard, maybe. A fresh start, but dreams like that don't come cheap. The landowners later testified that Mark missed multiple settlement dates. Penalties started piling up, interest rates climbing as high as 14%. By August of 2000, the Lundys were drowning in debt, owing nearly $140,000 in penalty interest alone, and the final payment deadline was August 30th, the exact day Christine and Amber were found dead. Now, just 5 days before the murders, the couple had signed papers to increase their life insurance from $200,000 to $500,000. Christine's signature is still fresh on the page, but the new policy hadn't been processed yet. The insurance rep, Bruce Parson, made that clear. The increase wasn't active. Still, Christine was dead before the paperwork went through. After the murders, Tower Insurance did cover $75,000 of the Lundy mortgage, but there was no big payout, no $500,000 check, just grief and suspicion. From the outside, it looked like a family chasing big dreams. But underneath the cracks were already forming. Before we dig into those cracks, let's take a step back to Tuesday, August 29, 2000. It was a chilly, uneventful day in Palmerston North. The kind of day most people would forget. But by the next morning, that quiet little town would never be the same again. That morning, Mark Lundy climbed into his car and hit the road for Wellington. It was just another business trip for him. Selling kitchen sinks and fittings was his everyday grind, and these work travels were nothing new. Sometimes he'd be gone overnight, sometimes just for the day. Nothing about that Tuesday raised any red flags. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, Mark checked into the foreshore motor lodge in Paituan, a peaceful suburb in Lower Hutt. The receptionist saw nothing unusual. He got his room key, settled in, and from the outside, it looked like everything was normal. He had an alibi and apparently no reason to head back home. Just 30 minutes later, at 5:30, his cell phone rang. It was a call from home, either Christine, his wife, or their daughter, Amber. They chatted for about 8 minutes. Mark later told police that one of them mentioned they were going to grab dinner at McDonald's. That detail checked out. Police later found a McDonald's receipt in the Lundy home, time-stamped at 5:45 that evening. It was solid proof that Christine and Amber were alive at that time. An ordinary moment frozen in grease-stained paper. But things slowly began to shift. At around 7 o'clock, Christine answered a phone call from a friend. She sounded normal. No panic, no strange tone, no hint that anything was wrong. Whatever horror was about to unfold in that house hadn't happened just yet. Meanwhile, back in Paituan, Mark kept going about his evening. At 8:28, he made a phone call to a business associate to talk about an investment in a vineyard project in Hawke's Bay. But back in Palmerston North, something sinister was creeping in. The last sign of life in the Lundy home came at 10:52 that night when the family computer was manually shut down, not unplugged or crashed, properly turned off by someone. That simple action raised alarm bells. Some believed it marked the moment when the killer finished what they had come to do. Later that night at 11:30, Mark made another call, but this time not to a business partner. He contacted an escort service in Paituan. A woman was sent to his motel and reportedly left around 1 o'clock in the morning. This detail would later become a cornerstone of his alibi. How could a man be involved in a brutal double murder in another city while hosting a visitor at his motel room? But it wasn't the escort's visit that would flip the story upside down. It was what happened the next day. On Wednesday, August 30th. Sometime mid-morning, Christine's brother, Glenn Wedger, came by the house. He had a business matter to discuss with her, but when he knocked on the front door, no one answered. He walked around the back and noticed the ranch slider door was unlocked. As he walked inside, he found Christine's lifeless body on the bed, covered with blood. She had been struck in the head multiple times, so violently that fragments of bone and brain had splattered the walls. In the doorway of her bedroom, Amber was found face down on the floor, still in her nightgown. She hadn't made it far. Like her mother, she too had been attacked with the same level of brutal force. The killer showed no mercy. This wasn't just murder. It was rage. Police rushed to the scene and immediately knew something was off. A back window looked like it had been tampered with, maybe to stage a fake break-in. But there was blood on the frame and it belonged to Christine. It felt like the killer had tried to make it look like someone had broken in, but only after the killings were done. The scene was both vicious and calculated. At first, it looked like a robbery. A small jewelry box was missing, which led investigators to wonder if someone had broken in for valuables, but nothing else of value was touched. Why take only a trinket box and leave everything else behind? This wasn't a random act. It felt personal. The injuries were so extreme, detectives believed the weapon was something like a tomahawk. Small, sharp, easy to swing, and just as easy to get rid of. That led to the biggest question of all. Who would do this? Who had a reason, the opportunity, and the time? That's when the focus turned to Mark Lundy. Police believed he was responsible. But here's the twist. Depending on which version of the case you follow, they couldn't even agree on when it supposedly happened. In one version of events, Mark left his motel after the business calls, drove more than 150 kilometers back to Palmerston North, killed his wife and daughter, then sped back to Pet 1 without anyone noticing he was gone. Another theory sent even more chills down spines. According to that version, the murders didn't happen during the evening hours. Instead, they claimed Mark Lundy snuck away from his motel sometime after midnight, right in the tiny window between making a call to an escort service and the woman arriving at his room. That gave him less than 1 hour to drive all the way back to Palmerston North, brutally murder his wife and daughter, clean himself up, and return to the motel like nothing had happened. Think about that. Less than 60 minutes to cover over 300 kilometers, commit a savage double homicide, and get back without a trace of blood, guilt, or evidence. No one saw him on the road. No traffic cameras caught a glimpse of his car. No petrol receipts, no roadside witnesses, no motel staff noticed him leave. And yet, somehow, police believed he had made that drive, not just once, but twice, all in a single night. A disappearing act worthy of fiction, except it was being treated as fact. Then came the moment that would divide a nation, not in the courtroom, but at the gravesite. They say grief hits everyone differently. Some people shut down, some collapse, and some wailed in the sky. But when Mark Lundy buried his wife and his only daughter, his grief didn't just spill out. It exploded in front of cameras. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't subtle. It was broadcast. Just days after Christine and Amber were found slain in their home, a funeral was held. The church overflowed with mourners. The entire town felt broken. 2 innocent lives had been ripped away in the most violent way imaginable, and there were still no arrests. People came to grieve, to remember, to find peace. And then Mark Lundy arrived, staggering between friends. He could barely stay upright. Cameras rolled as he sobbed uncontrollably. His face contorted in agony. His cries echoed. He shook violently, collapsed to the floor, and had to be held up by those around him. It was the kind of grief most people hope they'll never experience. But for others watching, it was too much. Something about it didn't sit right, and slowly something dangerous began to grow. That display of grief, which should have been a private moment of mourning, became a public referendum on guilt. Was he crying too much? Was it real? Or was it a performance hiding something darker? Years later, in 2018, even the Court of Appeal acknowledged the impact of that scene. They believe jurors were likely exposed to repeated broadcasts of Mark's funeral breakdown during his trial. It could have been in the courtroom on a nearby screen, or maybe during lunch breaks while the news blared in the background. Either way, the image stuck. Jonathan Eaton QC. Mark's own defense lawyer didn't sugarcoat it. He said the footage made Lundy look pathetic, almost comedic. The man seen flailing and wailing at his family's funeral had become more than just a grieving husband. He had become a suspect, trapped in the spotlight of public doubt. Whether it was intentional or not, the public spectacle of that day planted a seed of doubt. And in a case already plagued by blurred timelines and elusive evidence, that seed may have grown into something fatal. Because in the court of public opinion, grief that looks too big can sometimes feel like a lie. From the moment investigators stepped into the Lundy home, it was clear this wasn't a simple break-in gone wrong. There were no signs of a struggle downstairs, just silence. And then upstairs, an explosion of brutality. Blood everywhere, bone fragments. A child's body crumpled in a doorway. A woman bludgeoned so viciously her skull shattered. For weeks, police searched for a motive, a suspect, a weapon. Anything that would make sense of what happened that night. And then a breakthrough. Or at least that's what it looked like. Inside Mark Lundy's car, police found a polo shirt tucked away in a zipped-up tool bag. It was stained. Too small to notice at a glance, but enough to raise suspicions. The shirt was sent off for testing. At first, they found nothing conclusive. But then came the second round of testing, and that changed everything. A laboratory in Texas, yes, Texas, examined the shirt and came back with a shocking claim. The stains contain central nervous system tissue, human brain, or spinal cord matter. According to the Crown, it was Christine's. Specifically, her brain tissue had somehow ended up on her husband's shirt. It was the kind of detail that doesn't just suggest guilt. It screams at who, after all, gets their spouse's brain matter on their clothing by accident. The prosecution's story sharpened like a blade. They said Lundy had driven all the way from Payton to Palmerston North late that night, silently entered the home, and hit his wife and daughter to death. Then he drove back, cleaned himself up, and called an escort to solidify his alibi. They claimed he stuffed the shirt in the car afterward, stained with the very evidence that would betray him. But here's where things unravel. The science behind the testing, called mRNA analysis, was cutting edge, controversial, and according to some, unreliable. It had never been used in a criminal trial before, not in New Zealand, not anywhere. Experts clashed. In court, one side insisted the brain tissue was unmistakable and damning. The other said the results were riddled with flaws, prone to contamination, and should have never been admitted as evidence. Even the timeline didn't sit right. The prosecution had originally claimed Lundy committed the murders around 7 p.m., but then the evidence didn't line up. The phone records, the McDonald's receipt, the call to the escort, all of it suggested he was nowhere near Palmerston North at that time. So, they changed the theory. Now, they claimed the murders happened closer to midnight, that he made the 3-hour drive in a disguise, using extreme speed. Under cover of darkness in a window of time barely wide enough for everything he allegedly did. All this just to get back to his motel before sunrise with no blood in his car, no witnesses, and no physical weapon ever recovered. The defense tore it apart. They said the timeline was absurd, the evidence questionable, and the science untested. But by then, the image had been planted. A man with his wife's brain on his shirt. A husband, a father, or a monster. During the retrial, the prosecution changed their story. Now, the murders had to happen after 10:52 p.m., a theory they previously argued was impossible. It looked desperate. The defense hammered the inconsistency, calling it trial by timeline gymnastics. Because if Lundy couldn't have made that journey, if he couldn't be in two places at once, then everything else collapsed. Still, the Crown insisted the science overruled the clock. The shirt had brain tissue. The motive was dead. The means were rage. The timeline. They said it was just tight, not impossible. But for many watching the case unfold, that wasn't just a stretch. It was a canyon leap. Because this wasn't just a question of could he do it, it became a question of is it even possible? A second trial. That's what Mark Lundy faced in 2015. Nearly 15 years after his initial conviction, a revised case was built, complete with fresh legal arguments, expert testimonies, and an entire reworking of the timeline that had once betrayed him. The first trial had sent him to prison for life. But after the Court of Appeal ruled in 2013 that his conviction was unsafe, due to a combination of controversial science, an inconsistent timeline, and media influence, the case was reopened. So, Lundy found himself back in the dock. This time with new evidence, new questions, and a new chance to argue his innocence. But was it really a fresh start? The key pieces of evidence were the same. Brain tissue on Lundy's shirt, the financial motive, and the suspicious timeline. The defense was still going to fight the credibility of the forensic evidence. They had to. But what about the motive? The timeline? Could they build a case strong enough to counteract the years of speculation, media frenzy, and courtroom drama? The prosecution stuck with the brain tissue theory, arguing that it could only have come from Christine's head. But the defense wasn't having it. They tore apart the validity of the forensic findings, calling the mRNA analysis and experimental science. They questioned whether the analysis truly proved anything about the tissue, particularly when it came from a contaminated sample. Then came the timeline. The prosecution's case still hinged on the idea that Lundy could have driven from Pétuan to Palmerston North, killed his wife and daughter, and returned to Pétuan all in the dead of night within a time frame that defied basic logic. But this time, the defense argued it wasn't just a stretch. It was impossible. They called into question every single assumption the prosecution had made. But what about the motive? The defense wanted to know why Lundy would kill his wife and daughter just days after increasing their life insurance payout. Sure, the prosecution said it was all about the debt, but it didn't add up. Why murder your family when there were easier ways out? Why would the debt-ridden businessman go to such lengths when the insurance policy hadn't even gone into effect yet? And let's not forget the media circus. By the time of the retrial, Mark Lundy's face was etched into the public consciousness. The funeral footage had already been played to the point of it nauseating the viewer, and the perception of him as a grief-stricken father who might be faking it still haunted the jury. His dramatic outburst at the funeral had been analyzed endlessly. Too much grief, they said. Was it genuine, or was it all just an act, as the defense painted Lundy as a victim of circumstance? It felt like a battle of facts versus perception. On one side, the prosecution clung to the scientific evidence, even if it was controversial. On the other, the defense tried to poke holes in every single assumption, from the forensic evidence to the timeline to the motive, all while painting a picture of a man who had been wrongfully accused. But in the end, after all the arguments, expert testimony, and battles over science, the jury's decision would come down to one question. Was Mark Lundy truly guilty of 2 brutal murders, or had the system failed him? The retrial would conclude in Mark Lundy's conviction once again, guilty of murdering his wife Christine and daughter Ember. The timeline discrepancies, the questionable forensic science, and the shattered public perception weren't enough to save him. This time, the battle for truth, however, wasn't over. Lundy's lawyers promised an appeal, but it would be years before the final resolution. In the hours following the brutal murders of Christine and Amber Lundy, the first person to arrive at the crime scene wasn't a detective or a police officer. It was Paul Peterson, Christine's brother. And in the chilling silence of that moment, everything about his presence seemed off-kilter, as though fate had placed him in the center of a storm that would rattle the very foundations of his family's world. It started as any other day in the sleepy town of Palmerston North. But for Paul, the day would be branded in his memory, for reasons that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It began, strangely enough, with a phone call from his sister. Christine had promised him that they would discuss a family matter. But when Paul arrived at the Lundy home to meet with her, something felt wrong. The front door was ajar, and a sense of foreboding washed over him as he stepped inside. Then he found them, Christine and Amber Lundy, their lives violently stolen from them. For Paul, the discovery was a moment frozen in time, one that could never be undone. As he entered that crime scene, there was no going back. He had walked into a nightmare, one that would unravel the very fabric of his family's life. But what stood out most was the eerie sense of calm that seemed to surround him. When Paul Peterson found the bodies, he did what anyone would do. He immediately called the police. But as investigators began to piece together the timeline, something didn't add up. Paul had been the first to arrive at the house and had discovered the bodies. The question loomed. Could Paul have been involved in the murders? Was his cool demeanor in the aftermath a sign of guilt? Or was he simply a man consumed by the horror of what he had just found? The police quickly realized that there was an unsettling pattern emerging. Paul had not only been the first to discover the bodies, but his actions and testimony were pivotal in shaping the narrative of the crime. But there was something unnerving about how he recounted his discovery. The images of Paul calmly entering the house, speaking to officers, and later testifying at trial were captured. And each time they replayed his somber tone, a cloud of suspicion hung over him. The more the investigation progressed, the more the spotlight fell on Paul Peterson. As Mark Lundy was arrested and charged with the murders of his wife and daughter, Paul Peterson remained in the shadows almost as a ghost, the silent witness to it all. But what many didn't realize was that Paul, in his own grief, was beginning to attract his own set of questions. Had Paul been too calm in the aftermath? His measured reaction to finding the bodies and his cold recounting of the crime scene was later scrutinized by those who wondered if this was the reaction of someone who had committed the murders? Was his calm demeanor a defense mechanism, or was it something more sinister? Could it be that Paul Peterson knew more than he let on about the deaths of his sister and niece? Though Paul was never formally charged or implicated in the crime, the suspicion around him never truly disappeared. People in the community couldn't help but wonder if he had been too close to the crime, and some began to question if the investigation had missed something important, perhaps a detail in Paul's testimony or an action he had taken before calling the police. In the end, despite the lingering suspicions, Paul Peterson was never charged with the murders of his sister and niece. The investigation moved on to focus heavily on Mark Lundy, and Paul returned to the periphery of the case. After years of legal proceedings, Mark Lundy was acquitted in 2019 after the Court of Appeal found that the case against him had been fundamentally flawed. The court ruled that there was insufficient evidence to support his conviction, and the brain tissue evidence, which had been one of the most critical pieces of the prosecution's case, was deemed unreliable. The timeline presented in the trial was also deemed to be full of gaps and inconsistencies that cast doubt on the original conviction. The retrial had exposed significant weaknesses in the case, and with the new evidence pointing toward reasonable doubt, the Court of Appeal concluded that the conviction was unsafe. As a result, Lundy was acquitted of all charges. The case may have reached its legal conclusion, but one thing is certain: the truth remains elusive, just out of reach. Story 4. Now to a Wisconsin teenager accused of killing his parents to fund an alleged plot to kill President Trump. Yes, you heard it right. This teen would go on to kill his parents, slept with them for days, and later on planned to kill President Trump, all because of one twisted mindset of being a white supremacist. But before all of that, who is this teen really? And how does someone go from being an outstanding student to planning something so horrifying? What's it like to hear that about your neighbor? It's terrible. I was just so torn by it. His name was Nikita Kasap, though most people just called him Nicky. He was only 17 years old, a high school student living in the quiet suburbs of Wauwau, Wisconsin. A place where neighbors wave good morning and families walk their dogs after dinner. On the surface, his life seemed almost picture perfect. He lived with his mother, Tatiana Kasap, and his stepfather, Donald Meyer, in a spacious 4-bedroom house on Cider Hills Drive. It was a beautiful home, 3,000 square foot of calm suburban comfort, complete with a loyal family dog named Toby. People who knew Nicky said he was quiet, maybe a little introverted, but polite and respectful. He was even named Student of the Month at his school, the Wauwau Health Department High School. His attendance was flawless. His grades were solid. There was no warning sign, at least none that stood out until he stopped showing up. Nicky's last day at school was February 12, 2025. At first, no one thought much of it. Kids get sick. Families go on sudden trips. But as the days passed, concern grew. Weeks went by and still no sign of Nicky or his parents. The school received one email claiming Nicky was sick, but something about it felt off. The email couldn't be verified. Then things got even stranger. On the morning of February 28, Judith Meyer, Donald's mother, called in for a welfare check. She hadn't heard from her son in weeks, and she was worried. Around the same time, a school resource officer at Nikki's high school, also contacted police. That made 2 separate welfare check requests in just 5 minutes, so it was enough for the Waka police to act. Now, officers arrived at the house on Cider Hills Drive at approximately 10 to 11 that morning. They knocked on the door, but no answer. They walked the perimeter and still nothing. So, they turned to the area's automated license plate recognition system, cameras that scan and record vehicle activity. And what they found raised even more questions. Donald's black 2018 Volkswagen Atlas Cross Sport hadn't been seen since February 23. Tatiana's white 2019 BMW last seen way back on February 11, the very same day Nikki stopped going to school. Because of this discovery, alarm bells were now fully ringing. Police then contacted Donald's employer. His manager told them that Donald had been texting and sick between February 13 and February 25, claiming he wasn't well enough to speak on the phone. He said he'd be back at work by March 3, but the manager noted something chilling. Those messages were completely out of character. Donald was reliable and communicative. So for him to go completely dark like that was bizarre and deeply troubling. At 1:52 in the afternoon, after hours of silence and unanswered questions, police forced entry into the home. What they discovered was every officer's nightmare. The moment they stepped inside, the unmistakable odor of human decomposition hit them. In the hallway near the kitchen, hidden under a pile of blankets and clothes, was the body of Tatiana Kasap. She had been shot 3 times, twice in the stomach, once in the neck. She was just 35 years old. Officers immediately exited the scene to obtain a search warrant. When they re-entered at 5 o'clock that evening, they found Donald Meyer's body in the first floor office. A single bullet wound to the back of the head. Execution style. He was 51, but Nikki, 17-year-old Nikki, and the family dog Toby were gone. Now, it's safe to say that the house was a mess. Furniture was displaced. Artwork had been taken off the walls, drawers, and had been rifled through, their contents scattered everywhere. The mattress from the master bedroom had been removed from its frame. Empty bank envelopes were found in the kitchen. Something had clearly happened here, and whoever did it had taken their time. With the parents dead and the son missing, investigators turned to surveillance and cell phone data, and what they discovered painted a haunting timeline. Nikki hadn't just fled. He had stayed in that house, lived in that house for 12 full days with the bodies of his murdered parents before finally leaving town in his stepfather's Volkswagen. He then traveled through 6 states, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, and Kansas. At 11:25 p.m. on February 28, the same day his parents' bodies were found, Nikki was located in Winfield, Kansas, more than 800 miles away from Wawa. He was arrested during a traffic stop. And what police found inside the vehicle left no doubt in their minds. On the floorboard of the car was a loaded Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver. It matched the description of a firearm recently purchased by Donald Meyer. Also found were rounds of ammunition, over 70 pieces of jewelry, multiple tablets for cell phones, 3 laptops, a safe that had been forcibly opened, and more than $14,000 in cash. There were also credit cards and driver's licenses belonging to his parents, and Toby, the family dog, was found alive in the car. After piecing together the evidence, authorities concluded that Tatiana and Donald had most likely been killed on February 11, 17 days before their bodies were discovered. Nikki had lived with the bodies for nearly 2 weeks before taking off with their car, cash, valuables, and even the dog. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, 2 counts of hiding a corpse, 2 counts of theft, operating a motor vehicle without the owner's consent, and 2 counts of identity theft. Now, here's where it gets even more chilling. This wasn't just a sudden outburst or a fight gone wrong. Prosecutors believe Nikita had been planning the murders for months, and he wasn't planning alone. According to court documents and witness testimony, Nikita had been messaging with someone in Russian through the app Telegram, a platform often used by extremists because it's encrypted and harder to trace. One of his classmates, only identified as Witness A, told authorities that Nikita said he had been talking to a man on Telegram and that the two of them were working together to overthrow the US government. Nikita even said they had plans to assassinate President Donald Trump. That's not just disturbing, it's terrifying. Now, when Nikita was arrested, we mentioned earlier that the police found valuable items in his car that pointed directly to him being the killer. However, there was one item that stood out above all the rest, an unassuming memory card. At first, it seemed like just another ordinary piece of evidence, but what was on it would send shockwaves through everyone involved in the case. On this memory card, investigators discovered images and videos that were nothing short of disturbing. These weren't just random shots. These were chilling recordings that showed Nikita actively documenting his crime. According to the criminal complaint, one of the most haunting videos captured Nikita adjusting a camera and then pointing it directly at the dead body of his stepfather, Don Meyer. This was no accident. Nikita knew exactly what he was doing. What makes this even more sinister is what happened next. In the video, Nikita can be seen lighting candles around his stepfather's body. Why would he do that? Some believe he was trying to mask the awful smell of decomposition. But others suggest that this act wasn't just about hiding a smell. It was an eerie, almost ritualistic gesture. It's as if he was creating a scene, setting a stage for someone to witness his crime. But it doesn't stop there. The videos go further, showing Nikita allegedly pointing his phone at the body and speaking to someone on the other end of the line. This person remains unidentified, but in the video you can hear Nikita saying, "So you can see him there. I can literally see the body there." It's chilling. He wasn't just filming for his own satisfaction. He was showing someone else. Investigators believe this person could be the same man Nikita had been messaging on Telegram, discussing far more disturbing topics. According to reports, these messages involve plans to take down the US government. A thought that's as disturbing as it is confusing. Now, let's take a step back and look at Nikita's background. His story is not just one of a troubled teen. It's one of obsession and darkness. Nikita moved to the United States from Moldova at the age of 7. Moldova is a small country in Eastern Europe, right next to Ukraine, and it has strong Russian influences. But what's truly chilling is the fact that Nikita had very little family left in Moldova. His grandmother was the only relative still alive. Yet, he developed an almost unhealthy obsession with Russia, fascism, and violence. This obsession became even clearer when his classmate known as Witness came forward. According to her testimony, Nikita would send her horrific gore edits, videos that mixed graphic and violent imagery with Russian music. These weren't just random videos. They were carefully crafted clips that reflected the twisted mindset Nikita had developed. She described how Nikita even added her on Snapchat and began pushing for a relationship despite her clear lack of interest. But the creepiness didn't stop at unwanted attention. Nikita began talking about his desire to kill his parents. At first, he claimed it was just talk, something he didn't really mean. He reassured her in December of 2024 and again in January of 2025, but Witness could sense something wasn't right. She even told Nikita that he seemed like a Nazi and a school shooter. She told him he needed help, but despite her concerns, it seems she didn't report any of this to the authorities. He's been speaking with someone in Russian about moving to Ukraine after committing these crimes. So, the state is concerned that he's a flight risk if he is ever released. One of the most critical pieces of evidence came when police discovered a photo in January. It showed Nikita holding a Smith & Wesson handgun, the exact same weapon that investigators believe he used to kill his parents just a month later. This was not a coincidence. It wasn't until nearly a full month after his arrest that prosecutors officially filed murder charges against Nikita Kasap. By then, he had been caught in a small rural Kansas county and had appeared virtually for an extradition hearing. The case moved forward in the District Court of Trio County, Kansas under the case name State vs. Nikita Kasap. Later on, authorities extradited him back to Wisconsin where he made his first court appearance on lesser charges. At that time, prosecutors had not yet officially filed murder charges. But they were already signaling that they were coming. Initially, he was charged with taking his stepfather's Smith & Wesson handgun and the family car without consent, both of which carried serious weight considering the violent aftermath. Then came the autopsy reports which painted a horrifying picture. Don, his stepfather, had been executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head, likely from behind. His mother, Tatiana, suffered 3 gunshot wounds, one at close range to the neck and 2 others that were non-fatal. This detail suggested a chaotic and possibly prolonged encounter, raising more questions about motive, planning, and intent. It wasn't just a tragic event. It was a calculated act of violence. Still, in those early days, Nikita's bond was set at $250,000 as authorities worked to build the homicide case. 2 weeks later, the full weight of the law came crashing down. Prosecutors formally charged Nikita with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, the most severe criminal charges available under Wisconsin law, and 2 counts of hiding a corpse. These weren't just bureaucratic escalations. They were charges that, if proven, could send the 17-year-old to prison for life. Prosecutors declared him an extreme flight risk, citing his movements across state lines, his attempts to convert assets using a Bitcoin machine, and the $14,000 in cash and jewelry found on him. At the time of his arrest, they believed he had the means and possibly the connections to evade justice, and they pushed for bail to be raised to $5 million. But Nikita's defense team wasn't backing down. They argued that the initial charges, taking a gun and a car, couldn't even legally hold water since the items were taken from individuals who were already deceased and thus couldn't have given or withheld consent. When it came to the murder charges, they insisted that a $5 million bail was excessive and unattainable for a 17-year-old. They claimed that the $250,000 bond should remain, framing Nikita as a troubled teen, not a calculated killer. At the bond hearing, the judge was visibly exasperated, not just by the nature of the case, but by the handling of the legal process. The judge wasn't just lamenting the bond debate. They were raising a broader question. When the system is faced with a suspect who allegedly murdered both parents, attempted to cover it up, and possibly plotted his escape, shouldn't the full legal framework be activated? The judge continued, highlighting the mountain of evidence laid out in the complaint. There's video evidence. There are communications, transactions, a witness. It's all here. If you believe he's a flight risk or a danger, don't just haggle over numbers. Use the mechanisms built into the law to keep the public safe. Despite the prosecution's push, the judge didn't grant the full $5 million bail. Still, it was clear the court recognized the gravity of the situation. The idea that a teenager had not only killed his parents, but lived in the same home with their decomposing bodies for 12 days was profoundly disturbing. Authorities have linked Nikita to a neo-Nazi group called the Order of Nine Angles, and his manifesto allegedly called for a violent political revolution. As of the time this video was made, Nikki remains in custody with a bond set at $1 million. He faces multiple charges, including first-degree murder, and his trial is set to begin on May 7, 2025, where he will stand trial for 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. A side investigation in Wisconsin takes a shocking turn. Federal documents link a teen accused of killing his parents to an assassination plot against President Trump. According to ABC News, investigators found a manifesto from 17-year-old Nikita Kasap with references to making bombs, a terrorist attack, and plans for the president's assassination. Authorities also found material linking the teen to a network of neo-Nazis. Investigators believe Kasap may have killed his parents to get the quote financial means and autonomy needed to pursue his plan. The teenager is charged with first-degree murder and is scheduled to be arraigned on May 7. What makes this case truly chilling is not just the horror of the crime itself, but how a teenager, barely out of adolescence, could be so easily drawn into a world of extreme ideologies. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence comes from a series of messages Nikita exchanged with a man on Telegram. In these messages, Nikita is shown toying with the idea of fleeing to Ukraine, wondering about the possibility of escaping the consequences of his actions. He even wrote, "So while in Ukraine, I'll be able to live a normal life even if when it's found out I did it." These words reveal a shocking level of detachment from the consequences of his actions. But even more disturbing is the way Nikita acknowledges that no matter what, the world will eventually know he was the one responsible for the murders. What stands out in these exchanges is the disturbing fact that despite his delusions about fleeing to Ukraine, Nikita was very clear-eyed about one thing. The truth would eventually catch up to him. He wasn't trying to hide from the fact that he would be caught. He was simply trying to escape the fallout. But what's even more unsettling is how Nikita didn't even try to frame anyone else for the murders. There was no attempt to pin the crime on his parents or anyone else in the family. He didn't go through the motions of creating a false alibi. Instead, he accepted that the blame for the killings would fall squarely on him. This chilling realization only makes his actions seem colder, more calculated. Now, there are a lot of theories swirling around about whether Nikita's parents actually knew what he was planning, specifically his alleged desire to overthrow the U.S. government. Some believe they had suspicions, especially after receiving strange signals leading up to the murders. One particularly chilling detail comes from Donald Meyer's mother, Judith, who reportedly shared that her son had sent her some unsettling cryptic messages shortly before he went radio silent. These weren't your usual check-in texts. They hinted that something was wrong. But Judith didn't know just how serious it was at the time. So what if his parents did know something? What if they started to piece things together, noticed a shift in Nikita's behavior, sensed his growing obsession with radical ideologies, or even confronted him about his extremist beliefs? According to some theories, this might be exactly why Nikita targeted his parents first, to eliminate the only people who could stand in the way of whatever twisted plan he thought he was about to execute. Think about it. His parents knew where the money was hidden. They were the ones who gave him access to the house, the resources, even the revolver that was later used in the crime. Maybe Nikita believed that as long as they were alive, they were a threat to his vision. So he made a calculated decision to remove them from the equation brutally and without remorse. Story 5. What if the first knock at your door in the new year was the last one you ever answered? In a quiet Treen neighborhood, a family welcomed January 1st with all the warmth and excitement you'd expect. Holiday leftovers, plans for the year ahead, and a house full of love. But just hours into the new year, that home would become the scene of unspeakable horror. The fire was the first thing neighbors noticed. Thick smoke pouring from the windows, sirens slicing through the winter calm. What firefighters found inside wasn't just shocking. It was pure evil. The kind of scene that silences even the most seasoned investigators. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was intentional. And whatever happened behind that front door didn't end quickly. So, what could drive someone to annihilate an entire family, children included, in cold blood? And what darkness walked through that door? On New Year's Day? The first hours of 2006 were slipping by quietly in Richmond, Virginia. Neighborhoods like Woodland Heights still carried the hushed stillness of the holidays. The kind of silence that wraps around homes, where families sleep in, still basking in the glow of the previous night's celebrations. But as the afternoon crept in, smoke began billowing from one of the houses on West 31st Street. And with it came the unraveling of a horror that would leave an entire city shaken. Fire crews rushed to the scene, expecting a routine call. A kitchen fire, maybe a tree gone up in flames. Instead, what they stepped into was something far more sinister, far more cruel. The source of the fire was deliberate, but the fire wasn't the true tragedy. In the basement of the burning home, beneath the weight of smoke and soot, lay 4 bodies. Their limbs were tightly bound with electrical cords and tape, the adhesive still clinging to blistered skin. All had been bludgeoned, struck with devastating force by what would later be confirmed as a claw hammer, and every one of their throats had been slashed in what could only be described as an execution. It was a scene of staggering violence, haunting and prolonged. A family hadn't simply been killed. They had been hunted inside their own home, restrained, tortured, and slaughtered. The bodies were positioned close together in the basement, suggesting they may have been held captive for some time before the final blows were delivered. The perpetrators had not only inflicted terror, they had stayed long enough to watch it unfold. Then, as a final act of desecration, they lit the house on fire, not in panic, but with the cold, organized intent to cover every trace of what had happened inside. The victims, Catherine, Brian, Stella, and Ruby Harvey, were known in Richmond not as celebrities, but as neighbors, parents, artists, and business owners. The mother, Catherine, a woman of vibrant energy and creativity, had co-founded a popular toy store that was not just a shop, it was a cornerstone of the community, a place where childhood was celebrated. Her husband Brian, once a rising figure in the college rock scene, had built a quieter life in recent years, trading the noise of the stage for the gentle rhythm of fatherhood. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and beloved by friends for his introspective spirit and musical soul. Their daughters were just beginning to carve out their place in the world. The older one, named Stella, just 9 years old, had the precocious wisdom and curiosity of a child who reads far beyond her age. The youngest, Ruby, 4 and full of joy, had a smile that neighbors said could turn any day around. To see their lives end this way was to feel something fundamental tear loose inside anyone who knew them, or even just knew of them. The house, once filled with music, toys, and laughter, had been transformed into a garb of silence and ash. As news of the murders spread, grief gave way to confusion, and confusion turned swiftly into fear. There were no signs of forced entry, no known threats, no enemies. There was nothing to explain why such unimaginable cruelty had descended on this one household. But deep down, investigators could feel it. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a performance. It was controlled. This investigation was only the beginning of the horrors unfolding. They didn't come in with screams or chaos. They came with tape, with silence, with deliberate steps that signaled this was more than just a robbery. It was a performance of control. Gray moved first, dragging Catherine, Brian, and little Ruby into the basement and binding them tightly with packing tape. There was no rush in his movements, no sign that he was worried about time. Meanwhile, Dandridge roamed the upstairs like a scavenger, digging through the home's warmth and comfort for items to steal, casually turning a house into a hunting ground. And then the front door opened. Stella had returned from a sleepover, unaware that the walls of her home had already become a prison. Upstairs, her mother was briefly released, just long enough to bring her daughter down. The image of Catherine, pale, wordless, and composed, standing in the doorway of her daughter's friend's house, was something Kirsten Parenson would never forget. There had been something off, something drained in her face, but not a single word betrayed what was waiting behind her. Soon after, they were all in the basement, tied, surrounded by 2 vicious monsters. The illusion of safety had been sealed away, and with it, their final moments began to slip into the hands of monsters. What followed wasn't a frenzy. It was precise. Gray took his time. One by one, he used the blade, drawing it across their throats, the packing tape still pressed against their skin. But it wasn't over. After their bodies slumped into silence, he raised a claw hammer and struck each of them. Repeatedly, turning a cold execution into something far more invasive and far more grotesque. The medical examiner would later try to translate that chaos into something clinical. Brian and Catherine killed by blunt force trauma. Stella, smoke and crushing blows. Ruby, 4 years old, pierced in the back by a knife. One wound so deep it reached her lung. But numbers and causes don't begin to explain what happened in that basement. Even in the end, they didn't stop there. As if to add one final flourish, Gray and Dandridge knocked over a small art easel. A simple thing. Maybe something one of the girls used for painting, doused it with wine, and set it ablaze. It was petty. It was theatrical. It was meant to destroy not just the evidence, but the identity of the space. As flames climbed through the basement, curling around what was left. It might have looked like the scene of a tragic accident, but nothing about this was accidental. The fire didn't go unnoticed. Johnny Hott, Brian's longtime friend and the drummer from House of Freaks, spotted the smoke and made the call that would unravel everything. A fire department arrived to extinguish flames. But what they uncovered would ignite a storm far more devastating than fire. And the men who had walked out of that home hours earlier, calm, unhurried, untouched by the flames of hell they left behind, were already moving forward, as if for lives meant nothing at all. But who were Gray and Dandridge? You may wonder. The two men, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge, were no strangers to darkness. Born in 1977, these two were bound not just by blood, but by a shared legacy of violence and criminal behavior. It was only a matter of time before their twisted paths collided into unspeakable horrors. Ricky Gray had a history, one that was written in criminal records and failed relationships. He had been in and out of prison for years, known for his explosive temper and a knack for making life hell for anyone who crossed paths with him. He was no stranger to the life of a violent ex-con. And when he met Trev Odell, his third wife, things quickly escalated. Their relationship was anything but peaceful, full of shouting matches and physical confrontations that the neighbors often overheard. By November 2005, Trevor had had enough. But then she was found dead, her body brutally beaten and dumped in a shallow grave in Washington, Pennsylvania. But here's the kicker. The authorities initially wrote her death off as a drug overdose. Ricky's forearm had claw marks on it that day, signs of a struggle, maybe even signs of a fight for her life. But the police didn't connect the dots. They didn't see the killer standing right under their noses. Enter Ray Dandridge, Ricky's nephew, just out of prison after serving more than a decade for armed robbery, moved in with Ricky and Trevor after his release in October 2005. By the time Trevor's body was found, Ray had already begun to show his true colors. The violence was in his blood, too. So, what did the two of them do after Trevor's body was buried? When no one was paying attention, they moved on. By Christmas, Ricky and Ray had packed up and headed to Arlington, Virginia, hoping to lay low. But the violence didn't stop. In fact, it only got worse. On New Year's Eve, just a few days after settling in Virginia, they decided to attack Ryan Carey. Ryan was beaten and stabbed, left to die in front of his own home. He later woke up in a hospital, his body broken, his right arm permanently useless. And as he recovered, he would tell the police exactly who did it. Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge. But that wasn't even the worst of it. No, the real nightmare began on January 1, 2006. That was when they came for the Harvey family in Richmond. Catherine, Brian, Stella, and Ruby Harvey were just living their lives. Or at least they were until two strangers forced their way into their home. Gray would later admit that they were desperate for money. That was the whole reason behind the plan. They hadn't even picked the Harvey home specifically. They just noticed the front door was open and took their chance. Once inside, they held the family hostage. When the family's friends arrived for a scheduled play date, Gray and Dandridge forced Catherine to act like everything was fine. They told her if she slipped up, her family would die. She stayed calm and played along, trying to protect her husband and kids. When the friends left, all hell broke loose. But Gray and Dandridge weren't done. After the Harvey family was left for dead, they burned the house down, trying to destroy the evidence, trying to hide what they'd done. It didn't work. A few days later, they turned on their accomplice, Ashley Baskerville. She along with her parents became the next victims of this brutal killing spree. By now, the authorities were piecing together the trail of violence left behind, and it didn't take long before they arrested the two men. It all started to unravel with an ordinary robbery in Chesterfield County, Virginia on January 3, 2006. Or at least it appeared to be. A couple living on Hollywood Drive became the latest victims of a well-rehearsed cold-blooded crime. The trio of criminals, two men and a woman, knocked on the couple's door, claiming to be lost and asking for directions. It seemed harmless enough at first, but it was anything but. The moment the door opened, the robbers pushed their way in, taking the couple by surprise. They ransacked the house, swiping a computer, a television, and $800 in cash. But when the husband attempted to stall the robbers by pointing out his wife's disability and his need to care for her, the criminals hesitated. It was enough to make them reconsider tying the couple up, but the damage was already done. They had been targeted, their home invaded, and the robbers made off with their stolen goods. It wasn't long after this crime that the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. On January 6, 2006, the phone rang at the Chesterfield police station. A concerned resident was worried about her daughter's friend, 21-year-old Ashley Baskerville, and her strange ties to two men, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge, both of whom had stayed at Ashley's home as house guests and were now suspected of being involved in the Harvey family murders. The tip led investigators straight to Ashley's doorstep, and soon police were swarming the house on East Broad Road where she lived with her mother Mary Baskerville Tucker and her stepfather Percy L. Tucker. Inside, the police found a nightmare. The house was a wreck, a clear sign of the violence that had taken place there. Percy L. and Mary had been savagely slashed across the throat. Their lives extinguished in an instant. The real horror lay in what they had done to Ashley. She wasn't just dead. She had been suffocated. A plastic bag had been wrapped around her head and sealed tight with duct tape. The same tape used to bind her and her family, ensuring they could neither scream nor escape. All three victims had been gagged and bound in a home where they had been so violently silenced. It didn't take long for the police to connect the dots. The items found at the Baskerville Tucker home, a computer, a television, matched the stolen property from the Chesterfield home invasion, tying the whole thing together. But one item that made them 100% sure was the ring Ashley was wearing. It was Catherine Harvey's wedding ring. Gray and Dandridge had been on a spree. Their bloodlust not yet satisfied. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was the continuation of a spree that had already left a trail of destruction in its wake. And it was only just beginning. Gray and Dander's rampage had escalated from one target to another, their violence becoming increasingly brutal and heartless. As they turned their attention to Ashley and her family, they set off a chain of events that would lead to their eventual capture and the revelation of the full extent of their depravity. On the morning of January 7, 2006, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge were finally caught. The police found them in Philadelphia staying at Dandridge's father's home. Just an hour after their arrest, Dandridge couldn't hold it in anymore. He confessed to murders of Mary and Percy L. Tucker, as well as Ashley Baskerville. But that was just the beginning. 12 hours later, Gray, who had been quietly simmering in his cell, asked to speak with a detective. What followed was chilling. Gray handed over a detailed 3-page confession. He didn't hold back. In his confession, he described how he'd killed the Harvey family using a kitchen knife and a claw hammer to brutally end their lives. He didn't try to justify his actions. Instead saying, "I don't believe sorry is strong enough." None of this was necessary. But even as he confessed to the Harvey murders, he didn't stop. He went on to admit that he had beaten his wife, Trevor, to death while Dandridge held her down and that he had been part of the Tucker Baskerville murders. Gray even confessed to the brutal attack on Ryan Carey. The floodgates had opened and everything came pouring out. As the investigation progressed, the police pieced together more and more of the story. By January 8, 2006, they had confirmed Ashley Baskerville's involvement. She wasn't just a victim caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had actively participated in the robbery and murders. Evidence, including testimony from witnesses and items found during the investigation, made it clear that she had played a role. Ashley had been the lookout while Gray and Dandridge entered the Harvey home to rob them and later became a used toy that those monsters randomly threw away one day. In their confessions, Gray and Dandridge claimed Ashley had pretended to be a victim. She had allowed herself to be tied up as part of the plan to rob her parents. But when things went south, Gray decided he was done with her. He didn't need her anymore, so he killed her, too. And then stole her parents' car to make their getaway. The whole thing was a twisted series of lies, manipulation, and brutal violence. What started as a robbery spiraled into something much darker, and the confessions from Gray and Dandridge reveal just how deeply they were involved in the deaths of so many people. The aftermath of their arrests would send shockwaves through the community, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions. The court proceedings for Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge were as intense and chilling as the crimes they committed. Both men were tried in the city of Richmond Circuit Court in Virginia with the weight of the murders hanging over them. On February 9, 2006, things started to take shape legally. Ricky Gray was charged with 5 counts of capital murder for his role in the horrific murders of the Harvey family. These charges included killing more than once in a 3-year period, committing multiple murders in a single act, killing during a robbery, and killing 2 children under 14 years old. Meanwhile, Dandridge was charged with 3 counts of capital murder for the deaths of the Baskerville Tucker family. Though later one of those charges would also cover his role in the Harvey murders. At first, Dandridge pleaded not guilty, but as the trial went on and the case against him grew stronger, he made a dramatic change. Just before the closing arguments, he switched his plea to guilty for all 3 murders, agreeing to a deal that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life without the possibility of parole. This was his way of avoiding the death penalty, but his guilt was clear. Gray, on the other hand, stuck with his not guilty plea. His defense team tried to argue that he had suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child and that he was under the influence of PCP at the time of the murders, hoping for some leniency, but the jury wasn't swayed. After a 4-day trial and just 30 minutes of deliberation, they found him guilty on all 5 capital murder charges. The jury recommended the death penalty for the murders of the Harvey children, Stella and Ruby, while suggesting life in prison for the other 3 charges. On October 23, 2006, Gray was officially sentenced to death. But the legal battles didn't end there. In December 2006, Ricky Gray was also indicted for the murder of 37-year-old Cheryl Warner, a mother of 3 whose body was found in a burning house in Pepper County. She had been shot and hanged in the basement, another horrific act that Gray would have to face. However, this charge was eventually dropped in 2008 because of contradictory evidence. Even after his sentence, Gray's case dragged on. Between 2011 and 15, his execution was delayed multiple times due to appeals in both state and federal courts. In November 2015, the Fourth Circuit Court rejected one of his appeals. And in January, a year later, Gray's execution was set for March 16, 2016. But the delays didn't stop there. His lawyers filed yet another appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court, which chose not to hear his case later that year. Finally, in 2016, after all the appeals were exhausted, Governor Terry McAuliffe denied Gray's clemency plea. His execution was scheduled for January 18, 2017. And at around 10 p.m. that night, Ricky Gray was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center. As for Ray Dandridge, he's still serving his life sentence in Sussex 2 State Prison. His story didn't end with the trial, and the weight of his actions still hangs over him as he remains behind bars. The trial and the aftermath showed just how deep the darkness went with these 2 men, Gray, who would eventually face the ultimate penalty, and Dandridge, who would live out his days in prison. Both men left a trail of devastation that still echoes in the Richmond community to this day. But as the dust settled, One question continues to haunt those who were left to pick up the pieces. Story 6. June 30th, my sister decided to make the only correct choices in episode 1 of season 1 of The Walking Dead games. And for that, her face will be mutilated further than necessary. He was planning a school shooting, but before he could get there, he turned the shotgun on his own family. His mother, his 13-year-old sister, his 16-year-old brother, each killed while the town slept, unaware that a nightmare had unfolded behind closed doors in a quiet London flat. 3 lives ended in moments, and that was only the beginning. In a country where the word school shooting still echoes with the haunting memory of Dun Blaine, the idea of another such horror unfolding on British soil felt distant, almost impossible. Since that tragic day in 1996, the United Kingdom had remained largely untouched by the kind of violence that felt all too familiar. Across the Atlantic, there had been whispers, failed plots, signs caught just in time, but never the actual act of violence. That line, it seemed, hadn't been crossed again. Not yet. But evil doesn't always begin in a school. It may be growing within the walls of a warm home built by a loving mother. Juliana Prosper knew something about starting over. Born as Juliana Falcon on a fine June day in 1976. Her early life unfolded thousands of miles away in Mar del Plata, Argentina, a coastal city where the waves carried ease with hardship. She was the kind of woman who never stopped moving forward. No matter what life hurled her way, when she left her homeland behind and built a new life in England, it wasn't just geography she changed. It was an entire future. She married Ray Prosper and together they raised 4 children. Her world revolved around them. Juliana wasn't flashy or loud, but she had a quiet strength about her, the kind that carried the weight of being both gentle and fierce at once. By 2024, she was living in a modest flat off Walds Bank Drive in Luton, caring for 3 of her children. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was steady, familiar, a mother's life. Built on routines, small joys, sacrifices that often went unnoticed. And while she held her family together, something was burning beneath the surface. Something too dark to see until it was far too late. There was a storm brewing within those walls in disguise of a boy who seemed too meek to even hit an object in his path. Nicholas Prosper was the kind of boy who didn't just fade into the background, he clung to it. A December child born in 2005, he came into the world quietly and for the most part stayed that way. Diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder early on, he walked through life a few steps apart from everyone else. Not always alone, but always slightly removed, as though he were watching the world through a speck only he could see through. In his younger years, he had friends, not many, but enough to keep him anchored. He wasn't a troublemaker, not in the traditional sense. He was geeky, they said. Soft-spoken, obsessive about computers. The kind of kid who could disappear into a screen for hours and still not feel like he'd scratched the surface. Teachers remembered him as bright, even promising. But what they couldn't see, or maybe chose not to see, was the slow erosion happening beneath the surface. The way isolation began to calcify into something harder, something darker. By the time he reached his late teens, that gentle geekiness had twisted into something far more unpredictable. He stopped trying to connect. The friend group dissolved. The screen stopped being a sanctuary and became something else entirely. A tunnel with only darkness at the end. Only reflections of death, hatred, and perversion. He spiraled down corners of the internet where empathy dies, where violence is glorified and human suffering is catalogued like some kind of collectible. At some point, he was banned from one such site, a morbid database where real death was archived and dissected like entertainment. But even there, even in that graveyard of humanity, Nicholas had crossed a line. He made comments in support of pedophilia, vile and unfiltered, as though empathy had been surgically removed from his vocabulary. He wasn't just watching the darkness. He was absorbing it. He was becoming it. And no one knew just how far that darkness had sunk, how deeply it had planted itself in his bones, how it was growing, feeding, waiting. Because Nicholas Prosper wasn't just withdrawing from the world. He was preparing for war. By the time September's Friday the 13th crept into the calendar, the plan had matured into something monstrous, no longer a passing thought or a twisted fantasy confined to the corners of a screen, but an intention rehearsed in silence and fed with obsession. Nicholas Prosper had immersed himself so deeply in the world of school shootings that his fascination had eroded whatever boundary there might have been between watching and committing. His mind was absorbed in the details of Sandy Hook. The timelines, the methods, the body count, not from a place of grief or horror, but from an ambition to create something even more devastating. A spectacle of violence that would end with him turning the weapon on himself, leaving behind a trail of bodies and questions that would never quite be answered. His choice of targets spoke volumes about his mindset. He didn't pick his old primary school because he had suffered there or because of some open wound from childhood. He picked it because he knew its insides. The security system, the classroom layout, the way the corridors turned, like someone choosing the most familiar battlefield for the most calculated slaughter. There was no emotional trigger, no personal vendetta, only cold strategic advantage. When he tried to acquire a firearm in August, the attempt failed, but rather than derail his plan, the setback only seemed to strengthen his focus. He had already been preparing for over a year, building the idea piece by piece in his mind, layering it with research, false starts, and obsessive planning. A delay didn't shake him. It gave him more time to refine the vision. On September 12th, just hours before he would destroy his family, Nicholas finally secured the weapon. He purchased a double-barreled shotgun and 100 cartridges for £650 from a local dealer using a forged firearms license that mimicked the real thing with disturbing accuracy. He had spent time studying every element of a UK license, the paper's weight, the seals, the placement of the official signatures, and had replicated it with extreme meticulousness. The dealer, though uneasy, believed the documentation to be genuine and notified police, but the warning came too late. The weapon was his. His timeline had locked in. As night took hold and the town around him drifted toward sleep, Nicholas wasn't winding down or hesitating. He was finalizing. His browser history from that night became a window into a mind that had spiraled beyond recognition. Search after search for methods of killing with a shotgun. Anatomical specifics, outcomes, the kind of blunt force horror that is usually reserved for war zones and nightmares. Mixed in were searches tied to necrophilia and to the murder of Sarah Everard, as though his appetite for violence was expanding even as the clock ticked toward morning. And then came the video, a final digital confession broadcast from his bedroom into the world. He described himself as a follower of Clementine, a fictional character from the Walking Dead video game series. Latching onto her image not for her humanity, but for some twisted symbolic allegiance that only made sense in his fractured reality. He spoke poison about his sister Giselle, referencing a choice she had made in the game months earlier, a moment so trivial that it might have been laughable had it not been spoken with such vile certainty. He said her face would be mutilated further than necessary, delivering the line with a coldness that felt rehearsed, devoid of any trace of human feeling. Though prosecutors would later argue that this reference was irrelevant to the murders. It felt like a sign that nothing, not even a game played with family, was safe from the rot that had taken hold of his mind. As the hours passed and darkness deepened, Nicholas Prosper stood on the edge of his own carefully constructed horror, armed, ready, and emotionally removed from everything that had once tied him to normalcy. Behind him was the quiet of a flat where his family slept, unaware that the boy they had raised, the brother they had laughed with, the son who once played video games in the next room, was preparing to become a vicious monster. Under the thin veil of early morning silence as the world outside remained unsuspecting, Nicholas Prosper sat alone in his room, watching violent animated pornography while continuing the same heinous research he had started the day before. It was well past midnight. By 4:32 a.m., he had already test-fired the double-barreled shotgun once into a teddy bear. His plan had been to kill 3 people, his mother and 2 younger siblings, in under 30 seconds. He thought the timing would be tight enough to escape detection by the neighbors. But Juliana woke up early. She wasn't supposed to. She saw her son with the gun. There was panic. There was shouting, and a struggle followed. Prosper attacked her with a knife first, slashing and stabbing her hands and arms as she tried to fight him off. He then shot her in the head close range, killing her. Her body would later be found sprawled in the hallway. Giselle heard the chaos and got up. She was shot at, the bullet grazing the back of her head. She ran, trying to hide under the dining table. He followed. He shot her in the face. Kay tried to resist. He grabbed the kitchen knife. He tried to fight. Prosper shot him in the chest from across the room. Then he walked over and stabbed him more than 100 times while Kyle begged him to stop. His lung was punctured. He still got up and ran. He made it to the hallway. Prosper shot him in the head. 7 cartridges were fired. He reloaded at least twice. Neighbors heard it all. The shouting, the fighting, the crashing sounds. One of them walked to the door to complain about the noise. She heard ruffling, a boy groaning, and then a shot. She turned around and ran. The first emergency call came in at 5:29 a.m. CCTV footage till 4.47 caught Prosper's eerily calm walk out of the flat at 5:33 a.m. Almost 20 minutes later, the police had reached the scene. They entered the flat at around 6. They found Juliana, Giselle, and Kyle. Blood streaks across walls, bloody handprints, bloodied knives scattered. A copy of How to Kill Your Family placed on Juliana's Body. Nicholas had packed the shotgun and 33 cartridges in a large bag. He started walking towards St. Joseph's Primary School, the same one he had attended, the same one he had planned to attack. But the school was still closed. Police activity was increasing. He didn't go through with it. He hid in a nearby wooded area for 2 hours. He shared the video he'd recorded earlier. The one about the Walking Dead. He tossed away 2 mobile phones, hoping to protect a group of pedophiles he had spoken with online. Nicholas also left the shotgun and ammunition in a bush near a playing field. At 7:55 a.m., he walked out from the woods and down Birmingham Road. He raised his hand to a passing police car. The officers were returning from the crime scene. They stopped. They saw the blood on his face and arrested him. "It's not murder," he kept repeating. He didn't want to show up. The courtroom was ready. The families were waiting. The hour was set. 10:30 a.m. sharp. But Nicholas Prosper, triple murderer, self-styled executioner, failed school shooter, was refusing to step back into the dock. Not out of fear, not out of remorse, because he simply didn't want to. At 8:45 a.m., word reached the judge. The convict was refusing to appear, and Mrs. Justice Jim Grubb wasn't having it. There would be no sentencing in absentia. He was to be dragged in if necessary, not for his sake, for the sake of the mother, the sister, the brother, the people whose blood he spilled. For those who had come to see the face of the boy who had torn their lives open. "You do not want to be here," she said from the bench. "But it is not your choice." She had him brought in. And he sat there in silence, staring straight ahead. Possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life and possession of a bladed article. After arrest, you displayed no signs of agitation or mental distress. You were inappropriately cheerful and engaged the officers in conversation. You asked if the local schools were locked down. You made no comment in interview but later gave a mental health nurse who was assessing you in custody some further details, including that you had planned for a year to kill 34 people ending in your own suicide. 30 of them were to be school children aged 4 or 5. Prosper had always rejected what the world had tried to give him. Help. Assessments, understanding, structure. His parents and teachers knew something wasn't right. They saw him withdraw. They watched him lose interest in the living, and wrap himself in shadows. They had begged for an evaluation. Reached out to child mental health services, tried to get him diagnosed for autism spectrum disorder. He refused it all, shut every door, sidelined every attempt. A psychiatrist would finally look into him, but not until after the murders. In the cold clinical light of custody, a diagnosis came. Mild ASD traits. A report detailed the hollow space where empathy should have been. It was not just a lack. It was an extreme lack, the kind that echoed through every corner of this case. He wasn't unreachable, but he was uninterested. There were no friendships, no real connections, only deep obsessive spirals about serial killers, about school shootings, about death as a spectacle. The judge laid it bare. These weren't just odd fixations. They weren't just dark corners of the internet. They were what shaped his identity. This boy, who had failed to hold even a thread of ordinary social interaction, had built himself a sanctuary in violence. The internet had opened the floodgates. He waded in freely. Every disturbing image, every cold commentary, every headline soaked in blood, it all fed him. Yes, there was an indirect link between his autism and the way he moved through the world. But as the judge made clear, ASD does not make one violent. It doesn't instruct a person to plan a massacre. It does not teach someone how to craft a fake firearms license. It doesn't guide their hands when they aim a shotgun at their own mother. That was Nicholas. And now, whether he wanted to or not, he had to listen to the law, to the families, to the judgment. Because monsters do not get to vanish quietly. They must be seen. They must be named. And they must sit shackled in silence while justice carves its final word. The courtroom was silent when the full story came out in March 2025. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence. They were planned in detail with a clear goal to become infamous. Nicholas Prosper murdered his mother, sister, and brother as the first stage of a broader scheme to carry out a mass shooting at St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School. The preparations had been ongoing for months. Prosper picked St. Joseph's because he knew it well. He had studied there, as had his siblings. He searched the school's website for photos of students and teachers, and noted the timing of assemblies and classes. Everything was methodical. He chose Friday the 13th deliberately, hoping the date would add weight to his actions. His plan was to kill his family early in the morning, leave home by 8:30 a.m. and arrive at the school during assembly to carry out a mass shooting. Earlier that night, he researched how to use the weapon and searched for disturbing content related to violence, including the murder of Sarah Everard and material connected to necrophilia. Neighbors heard the noise. Some reported shouts, banging, and groaning, followed by what sounded like gunshots. One went to the door to complain, but fled after hearing a loud bang. A police call was placed at 5:29 a.m. A chase of cat and mouse followed in what ended up as Nicholas being found with blood of his family on his face and clothes. He was charged with 3 counts of murder. He was also charged with possessing a shotgun and a knife in public, as well as acquiring a shotgun without a certificate. Child abuse images were later discovered on his phone, but no charges were filed for that. When the police found him, Nicholas Prosper stood in black and yellow. It wasn't a random outfit. He had chosen the colors on purpose. This was the look he wanted to be remembered by. The judge sentenced him to life with a minimum term of 49 years. Now, this does not mean that Nicholas will be out in the world in 49 years. A life sentence with a minimum term of this many years means that the person will spend the rest of their life in prison, but they must serve at least 49 years behind bars before they can even ask to be released. After the decided tenure, they can apply for parole, which is a formal request to be let out of prison. However, being eligible for parole does not guarantee release. A special board will review the case to decide whether the person is still a danger to the public. If they believe it is unsafe to let the person out, the person will stay in prison. Even if parole is granted, the person will remain under strict supervision for the rest of their life and can be sent back to prison at any time if they break the rules or commit another crime. Going back to the heinous crime that Nicholas committed, it didn't just shake a courtroom. It sent waves through an entire system that many believed was working just fine. But behind the horror of what Nicholas Prosper did was a quieter, more troubling truth. It had been far too easy for him to get his hands on a gun. Law enforcement knew it, and they weren't subtle about it. They pointed out how shockingly simple it still was for someone to sell a firearm privately. All a person really needed was a certificate, real or fake, and a willing seller, and that was it. No double checking, no verification, no questions, just a deadly loophole wide open. In response, police and safety officials started calling for changes that felt long overdue. One of their key suggestions was to build a national database for firearm license holders, something clear and central where every certificate could be checked against real records. And not just that, they pushed for a rule that would force sellers to get clearance from the police before selling a weapon to make sure the buyer had the right paperwork, real ID, and a legitimate reason to own a gun. But the danger wasn't only in how Nicholas got the weapon. It was also in what had been building inside his head long before he pulled the trigger. Officials spoke of an obsession, one rooted in endless hours online, wrapped in disturbing content, soaked in stories of mass murder, brutality, and control. What happened wasn't just a crime. It was a slow-growing sickness that had fed on unfiltered violence found in dark corners of the internet, completely unbothered and unchecked. Those watching this unfold didn't hold back. They saw this as a warning, one that wasn't just about guns or loopholes, but about the growing storm of violent content, reaching young people and changing the way they think, feel, and act. And the message from the government was clear. This couldn't be ignored anymore. They promised to act to make the laws more strict around private gun sales, to close the cracks and background checks, and to do more to protect communities from the kind of thinking that leads to something like this. It wasn't about just one tragedy. It was about making sure no one else walks the same path. With a weapon in their hands and a plan built from hate. Even after the government of UK has promised change, it takes time. And time is something we can no longer afford to waste. The next Nicholas Prosper may already be watching, waiting, learning just as quietly, just as patiently. And as the world spins forward, more connected and exposed than ever, the real question lingers in the quiet. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at Mr. Night Cared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.